The Solomon Islands in the southwest Pacific were a primary focus of Japanese pre-war military planning. Their location in a southeast line between Japan and Australia was pivotal for future military actions. The Solomons comprise a scattered range of some 900 islands, atolls, and islets that stretch more than 1,000 miles from northwest to southeast, between latitudes 5 degrees and 12°30 south, and longitudes 155 degrees and 170 degrees east, about 1,560 miles northeast of Sydney, Australia. The chain of islands covers a land area of nearly 11,000 square miles, spread over more than 500,000 square miles of sea. It is not difficult to conclude that control of this area would be a significant achievement. The primary part of the Solomons archipelago is south of Bougainville Strait and consists of a double range of 6 large islands of high elevation, Choiseul, Santa Isabel and Malaita in one group, and New Georgia, Guadalcanal, and San Cristobal in the other. The two groups are separated by a body of deep water known as the Slot to the Allies during World War II and to historians ever since. The archipelago extends some 249,000 nautical square miles southeastward from the strait on the west, past small Tulagi Island off Florida Island to the east. Few localities can surpass the area in sheer beauty, but unfortunately this natural magnificence is matched in intensity by the climate. Sultry heat, frequent and heavy rain, steaming jungles, and a multiplicity of insects and disease all combined to make wartime life in the Solomons decidedly uncomfortable. In 1568 and 1595, the Spaniard Álvaro de Mendana de Neira had explored the island area, but Europeans did not visit again until the 18th century. After 1830, British and American whalers and British warships anchored more frequently, and beginning in 1845, Roman Catholic and Anglican missionaries arrived. However, the missionaries had limited initial success converting the indigenous inhabitants, and a number were killed by the natives. By the early 1860s, other Europeans had settled in the Solomons, and recruiting of islanders began for work on the sugar plantations of Australia and Fiji. However, predatory recruiting practices called blackbirding, labour recruiting by deception, resulted in retaliatory killings of white residents and ships' crews. To remedy this situation and put an end to the widespread corrupt recruiting, in June 1893, Great Britain declared a protectorate over the southern Solomon Islands. Amateur naturalist Charles Morris Woodford is closely associated with the early history of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate. Woodford had first come to the Pacific in 1882, working for the Western Pacific High Commission, WPHC, in Suva, Fiji, and as a government agent in the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. He had made 3 extended trips to the Solomons between 1886 and 1889, and knew more about them than anyone, apart from the islanders themselves. In 1894, Woodford had hopes of obtaining the more permanent position of Resident Deputy Commissioner for the Solomon Islands, but London would not authorise the funds. As acting Deputy Commissioner, however, he prepared a report to be presented to the High Commissioner of the Solomons, Sir John B. Thurston, in which he literally appointed himself. Armed with his paperwork, Woodford set out for Sydney, and Thurston gave his signature and his blessing. During his tour as Resident Deputy Commissioner, Charles Woodford selected the island of Tulagi as the seat of government. Tulagi had one of the finest harbours in the South Pacific, with deep channels and spacious anchorages that would make ideal ports of entry for steamers and trading vessels, a quality the Japanese later recognized. On the 29th of September 1896, Chief Tambokoro and other elders met with Woodford and agreed to sell Tulagi Island to Great Britain for 42 ounces of gold. An official residency, government and civilian offices and houses soon replaced native huts, and Tulagi would be the Solomon Islands' administrative and commercial centre for the next 45 years. Between 1898 and 1900, Great Britain annexed the remainder of the Solomon Island group, offering protection for the residents and fostering further settlement and development. Woodford's vision of a productive society in the Solomons depended on efficient administration and a reliable economy. The primary export was copra, the dried coconut meat that yields coconut oil, and Woodford believed that the coconut plantations and trading stations would provide sufficient revenue to support and sustain the new government. He had planned to provide registered deeds to land on Guadalcanal and other islands as distant as the Shortlands in order to establish working estates. The concept was successful, and by 1930 more than 30,000 acres of coconut palms were under cultivation. The largest holding, more than 20,000 acres, was that of Lever's Pacific Plantations Limited, a subsidiary of the British firm Lever Brothers. By then, however, the Great Depression that had roots in the late 20s had begun to stall further growth. The purchase price of copra depended on European demand, but Europe also had been in an economic depression. Consumption slackened, and by 1931 copra demand had evaporated. The bottom fell out of the market, and plantations could not realize sufficient profits to offset their overhead. Field hands were released once their labor contracts expired, and as a consequence, many native laborers could not afford to pay the required government head tax. Resident Commissioner Francis Noel Ashley spent 10 years struggling with traders, planters, tradesmen, shippers, and anyone else involved in paying taxes, and plantations facing financial difficulties were sold, or in many cases simply abandoned. Such was the situation on the eve of the Second World War. The Solomon Islands, a sleepy backwater of the British Empire, would never be the same again. At 23:15 on the night of the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced on the British Broadcasting Corporation network that Great Britain was at war with Germany. Solomon Islands residents learned of the declaration on the BBC's International Evening News Hour, 16 o'clock local time. At 21:15, in a nationwide broadcast, Australian Prime Minister John Curtin told his country that Britain had declared war on Germany. A proclamation issued an hour later announced that Australia had joined the conflict. What Australia's contribution to the war effort should be, however, was difficult to determine immediately. The decision was complicated by uncertainty about Japan's intent, and by the fact that the strongest party in Australia's House of Representatives was opposed both to sending forces overseas and to raising home defence forces by conscription. The Commonwealth Government asked for Britain's views, and in response, the Dominion's office sent a detailed assessment by telegram on the 8th of September. The British felt that if Japan were neutral, it might be unwise for Australia to send an expeditionary force overseas, though she could assist by having formations ready to reinforce Singapore, New Zealand, or the British and French islands in the Western Pacific. If Japan were indeed friendly, it was hoped that Australia would prepare an expeditionary force and decide whether to relieve United Kingdom units in other areas as needed, or wait until complete divisions could be deployed. Eventually, Australia would send almost 4 full infantry divisions to serve in the conflict under British command. Although Australia had few land forces available for duty in the South Seas, her government was alert to the threat posed by Japan. For years, the Japanese had been accumulating useful military information in the Pacific. The country's strategic planning was based on the extensive intelligence gathering by her armed services and their overseas agents before the outbreak of hostilities. Starting in the mid-1930s, skilled espionage agents, often disguised as shell fishermen, had swarmed into the South Pacific, charting and evaluating the military potential of every island, reef, and shoal. The Pacific Islands Monthly had reported the presence of Japanese poachers off the coasts of New Guinea, Papua, the Solomons, the New Hebrides, New Caledonia, Fiji, and the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, but nothing was done about it, and the intelligence activity continued unhindered. When the Japanese went to war in December 1941, they had a fairly accurate knowledge of ground, air, and naval strength in the areas to be attacked, the locations of airfields and fortifications, and the terrain and climatic conditions in which they would have to fight. In the late 1930s, Cadet Martin Clemens of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Government Service, stationed on Malaita Island, took a Japanese fisherman into custody because of the man's unusual technique, fishing without bait. The man had a long pole with a rock tied to the end and was sounding the depth of the water. Clemens took him to Tulagi for judgment, but the defendant pleaded that he was a poor man who simply caught fish for a living. He claimed he had lost his bait and was using the rock to test the water's depth in order to bait his hook properly. The resident commissioner ruled that the poor man be released. He is only trying to make a living. Reluctantly, Clemens complied. Often the islanders informed Clemens that Japanese crews were diving for pearl shells on native-controlled reefs. They took undersized shells, thereby depriving the residents of both a present and a future livelihood. Clemens would try to catch the poachers, but by the time he had reached the locale, they had usually left the area. He later wondered if they eventually came back wearing the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Even while Clemens was investigating suspicious fishermen, a much bigger catch was at work nearby. In early 1940, Captain Tetsuo Toyofuku, a talented 1932 graduate of the Japanese Army Officer Academy, received orders from Imperial General Headquarters to survey the South Pacific. From January to April 1941, Toyofuku was secretly assigned as an intelligence officer to the South Seas Detachment, a unit that at the time existed in name only. He was to conduct a detailed topographical reconnaissance to determine the suitability of sites for potential landing operations in New Guinea and Papua, collect maps and related material on areas of the South Pacific, and investigate sources of war supplies in those areas. But investigating the islands was difficult, as the only maps available were British Admiralty charts dating to the turn of the century. The captain acted alone, except where he had gained the confidence of certain local Japanese who might help him. His close-cropped hair, a sure sign of a military man, made him stand out in the tropics. He could not pass for one of the businessmen who sold Japanese wares in the islands. Toyofuku thus had to change his appearance in order to ply his dangerous trade, and decided to pose as a seaman, intending to seek employment with a Japanese firm doing business in the South Seas. The largest such enterprise was Nanyo Bueki Kaisha Limited, South Seas Trading Company Limited, a Tokyo-based concern with numerous branch offices and small trading stations in the Pacific Islands. As a result of pressure from the Japanese government, the company's home office suggested to the Rabaul branch that Toyofuku be hired. Seaman Toyofuku was assigned to the Rabaul-based Takachiho Maru, a small motor vessel of some 350 gross tons, whose master, Kiyoshi Okubo, spoke excellent English and was said to be a walking encyclopedia. As diplomatically as possible, Captain Okubo informed the crew that the new seaman was not a sailor, and that they should provide him with all possible assistance. Okubo's cover story was that the government wanted Toyofuku to investigate certain locales to obtain specific information for an upcoming Japanese business venture. Toyofuku had ample funds available to accomplish his mission, and by liberal use of payoff money, the red envelope, he bought the cooperation of both Japanese and native crew members. The itinerary of the Takachiho Maru included the Caroline Islands, New Ireland, New Britain, New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, the New Hebrides, and the Solomon Islands. Toyofuku was able to see these areas firsthand, making observations with his Navy binoculars, taking photographs with his Leica camera, and writing notes in consultation with his hydrographic books and maps. However, anti-Japanese sentiment had grown considerably in the South Pacific since Japan's occupation of Indochina, and thus the islanders were suspicious of the Takachiho Maru. The crew's quarters were thoroughly searched by local port authorities and cameras were confiscated, but Toyofuku's Leica was never seized, for he had kept it and his film well hidden, along with his Nambu 8mm pistol. Because the vessel was in port only a short time, he generally stayed on board and cautiously took his photographs from the doorways to avoid being seen. No doubt the seagoing spy took pictures of Tulagi and its environs, though there was then no military establishment in the area. The resourceful Toyofuku next posed as a businessman seeking opportunities to promote Japanese products. He chartered a flight from Salamaua to Lae, on the north coast of eastern New Guinea, making mental notes of the two airfields and the coastline between them. Soon afterward, he returned to Japan with information that would be invaluable to the planners at headquarters. Among other things, His report covered the military significance of British New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Late in 1939, Francis Ashley's long tenure as Protectorate Resident Commissioner had come to a close, and he had turned the government over to his successor, William Sidney Marchant, a veteran administrator with 20 years of service in Kenya and Tanganyika. Life in the Solomons went on much as before. News of the war in Europe was heard every evening, and Europe seemed quite far away. But when German raiders disguised as Japanese transports attacked Australian shipping around the island of Nauru, just west of the Gilbert Islands, Protectorate residents began to be concerned about the island's political and economic future and about their own safety. Eventually, District Officer Dick Horton at AOLA on Guadalcanal found that the increasing war activity had made it impossible for him to leave his station. In addition, all district officers were now required to send a coded weekly report to the High Commissioner in Suva, Fiji Island, on unusual sightings and all movements of ships regardless of flag. This reporting continued until May 1942. To monitor Japanese activity, the Royal Australian Navy, RAN, activated its Coast Watcher network after the war began, linking local residents by teleradio, district officers, other government employees, plantation managers and traders. Among these were Martin Clemens, Donald S. McFarlane, and F. Ashton's Snowy Roads on Guadalcanal, Leif Schroeder on Savo, CNF Bengough on Melita, Michael J. Forster on San Cristobal, Donald G. Kennedy in New Georgia and the Western Solomons, Jeffrey H. Cooper on Santa Isabel, Colin E. J. Wilson and Mrs. Ruby Olive Boy on Vanikoro, Paul E. Mason in South Bougainville, and W. J. Jack Reed at Buka Passage, the narrow seaway between Buka and Bougainville. At about this same time, the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, began preparing seaplane bases in the British and French territories of the South Pacific. Its first Seaplane Patrol Squadron, No. 11, was organised in September 1939 and sent to Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, for reconnaissance duty. The squadron was equipped with 2 Empire flying boats, which the government had requisitioned from Qantas Empire Airways, and 2 Seagull amphibians. Almost half of its original personnel came from Qantas. Great Britain was supposed to supply 9 Sunderland flying boats, short 4-engine, to fill out Australia's air complement, but not enough aircraft were available to meet the requirements of its own Royal Air Force, RAF. Australia, therefore, looked to the United States, whose aircraft industry was busy producing planes for eager buyers overseas, even though the home market was inert. In June 1940, the Australian War Cabinet ordered 7 PBY-5 Catalina twin-engine Navy patrol bombers from Consolidated Aircraft Corporation in San Diego. In September, it ordered 11 more. The Australians numbered the planes in the A-24 series. America was not prepared to go to war, and to avoid further strain on her deteriorating relations with Japan, Consolidated Crews flew the Cats to Honolulu, where pilots and crews from the Australian Airlines took over and ferried them on to Australia. With its deep-water Simpson Harbour, Rabaul, on the northern tip of New Britain Island, was an excellent location for both a naval base and a seaplane facility, and in 1939 the Australian Air Force established a seaplane base there. Although the Matupi volcano regularly deposited on the city a dusty, snow-like ash that fouled unhooded engines, Rabaul's geographical position made it of strategic importance. On the eve of the Pacific War, it was garrisoned by 1,078 members of the Australian Imperial Forces, AIF, supported by a detachment of signalmen, engineers and artillerymen in the command of Colonel J.J. Scanlon. Under RAAF G-Capt John M. Leroux, 168 airmen of No. 24 Squadron staffed the airbase. The squadron's aircraft complement was just 4 Lockheed Hudson light bombers and 6 obsolete Wirraway, modified advanced trainers. On the 30th of April 1941, an echelon of 22 ground personnel arrived in Port Moresby to support the others already there. Additional personnel arrived later in the year, raising the total to about 250 airmen. The seaplane facility would become one of the primary bases for the Catalinas in the South Pacific. From there, the cats could fly search patrols covering the eastern seaboard of Australia, anchoring overnight in secluded bays and returning to Port Moresby the following day. The war spread so quickly, however, that funds allocated for the completion of the seaplane complex were never fully put to use, though dirt landing strips for fighters there were improved. Nevertheless, the RAAF's current air contingent was insufficient in strength to contain the Japanese. Fighter airfields would be needed later to prevent the Sun Eagles of Japan's Naval Air Force from destroying the RAAF contingent, along with the remnants of U.S. Army Air Corps units from the Philippines that GIs called the Scrawny Corps. In time, with the formation of No. 20 Squadron RAAF and the arrival of new long-range aircraft, the Catalinas were able to rotate between Port Moresby and Tulagi while flying reconnaissance missions. Port Moresby was defended by Australian troops, and as captured documents revealed, the Japanese knew this. Based on information obtained from a Japanese national who was at Moresby in 1941, Captain Fujisaki, no doubt an intelligence officer attached to the General Staff, estimated that before the 7th of December there was a 40-man Australian detachment with 2 6-inch guns on Paga Hill overlooking Port Moresby Harbour, as well as another group at nearby Pali Pali Point. In January 1942, Fujisaki revised his estimate of Moresby's defences to include 5,000 men housed in the vicinity of Granville East, another airdrome in the neighbourhood of Rauna Road, 7 miles from the town, and a seaplane anchorage north of Port Moresby. The Australians were particularly concerned about New Caledonia, the French possession lying 680 miles east of Sydney. The island was a major source of nickel and chromium, and the Japanese had more than 1,300 men working in the mines. After the outbreak of war in Europe, the Japanese began to purchase all the ore available. Meanwhile, at the imperial headquarters in Tokyo, the invasion of New Caledonia was already in the planning stage, known as the FS operation, named for the proposed sweep from Fiji through the Samoa Islands in an effort to force the Australians to surrender. Australia was the first to have military air and ground units in the Solomon Islands. An initial survey of the area was made in November 1939 when an Empire flying boat visited Tulagi. In May 1940, a seaplane returned, bringing ACM Sir Charles Burnett for a personal inspection and discussions with Resident Commissioner Marchant. As a result of these surveys, the Australians decided to establish an Advanced Operational Base, AOB, on the 2 nearly joined islands in the Tulagi area. WCDR John Brogan, the Australian Divisional Works Officer, and Group Captain Leroux, the commanding officer, CO, of No. 24 Squadron, were charged with finding a suitable site and arrived in the region in July 1940. The 2 officers liked the contours of Gavutu and Tanambogo Islands, which lie less than 100 feet from each other, about 2 miles east of Tulagi, all 3 adjacent to Florida Island. Although very small in size, Gavutu was 21 acres, Tanambogo only 13, they were sufficient and would become part of what would be called the Tulagi Advance Operating Base. Gavutu was fairly clear of undergrowth, but Tanambogo, where the airbase installations were to be constructed, was covered by a thick mangrove swamp and jungle. District Officer Donald Kennedy thus hired 52 Malaita labourers to clear the site and assist the survey team. Meanwhile, Brogan and Leroux inspected a location for an airbase at Port Vila on Efate Island in the New Hebrides, then returned to Tulagi with French surveyor Louis Page, who would help expedite the project. The 3 men and District Officer Kennedy's labour force worked from dawn until dark, and within 10 days the job was done. In addition, the surveyors visited Florida Island and mapped out a plan for a naval base there should one be needed. To provide an infrastructure for the Advanced Operational Base, in March 1941, Lever's Pacific Plantations initiated the construction of a stone causeway 8 feet wide and 75 feet long that would link Gavutu and Tanambogo. The company also had 4 galvanized huts built on Tanambogo's shore. Jack Svensson, whose family once owned Gavutu, and who was then working for Levers, arranged a labour contract for the hiring of 32 Florida Islanders as the permanent workforce. The Tanambogo Island facility included an administrative block, stores building, kitchen, sergeant's mess, airman quarters, marine equipment store, and a large T-shaped underground shelter. By the end of June, the 13-acre base was complete. On the northwest side of the island was a hill measuring 125 feet by 250 yards long. On the north side of the hill, a flat surface had been cut out to store 100, 250, and 500-pound bombs. A fuel dump in thick scrub occupied the south side. Typically, the base carried 90,000 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline dispersed in 44-gallon drums. Emergency reserves were hidden a few miles away in the jungle at Vura, on nearby Florida Island. The motor vessel, MV Wanaka, regularly delivered 1,000 drums, sufficient for 3 weeks to 2 months of air operations, depending on activity. At the peak of Gavutu's hill, the Australians constructed a radio station with an antenna, enabling signallers to maintain radio contact with Townsville, Queensland, and throughout the Pacific. A water tank made of timber and galvanized iron was also situated at the crest. On Tanambogo, a hidden radio transmitter was situated on the side of the hill, unobtrusively placed under a camouflaged tarp with side flaps that could be opened to catch the sea breeze. A remote-controlled direction-finding station was set up on postage stamp-sized Gyomi, a tiny satellite island east of Gavutu. The Tulagi Advanced Operating Base had an electric generating plant and 10 refrigerators. It was kept supplied with necessities by Burns, Philp and Company's steamer from Sydney, and by Tulagi, where Levers and W.R. Carpenter and Company had facilities, and where the Chinese stores stayed open until midnight. A small wood-frame building on Gavutu, which had been a medical clinic for Levers employees, became the Advanced Operating Base Hospital. The base was equipped with an 800-gallon refueling barge, the Betty Jane, a bomb barge, and a small launch with a 1.25 GP engine. A standard crash boat, used for rescuing aircraft personnel, was delivered in late March 1942. On the 12th of May 1941, the first Catalina from No. 11 Squadron arrived at Gavutu, assigned to monitor the seas for unusual activity and submarines. Initially, 4 Catalinas drawn from Numbers 11 and No. 20 squadrons at Port Moresby operated from the island. The aircraft were ideally suited for long-range patrol duty, with a range of 2,550 miles at 115 miles per hour and 1,500 miles with a bomb load, at slightly slower speed. If necessary, it could fly directly from Tulagi to the east coast of Australia without refueling. An advanced service unit was flown into the Tulagi base in July, and the RAAF began shifting more Catalinas from Port Moresby to Gavutu. The remaining personnel arrived by air at intervals through February 1942. A full complement of wireless operators was assigned to the radio unit, which was staffed around the clock. In mid-July 1941, G-Captor FWF Lucas, Air Officer commanding the southern area, and Commanding Officer Major J. Edmunds Wilson of No. 1 Independent Company flew to Tulagi from Efate in the New Hebrides Islands, where they had just arranged for Australian troops to be stationed at Port Vila. One of Wilson's commando units had moved from Australia through Rabaul on the 10th of July to occupy Kavieng, New Ireland. Lucas evaluated the air installations at Vila, while Major Wilson worked out the details of the Australian role in the defence of the base. Among other things, the commandos would assist in training the New Hebrides Volunteer Defence Force. Major Wilson made similar arrangements at Tulagi, where Resident Commissioner Marchant would have operational control of the local defence force. Additionally, one section of the 1st Independent Company was shifted from Kavieng to Tulagi. The 271 commandos of the Australian No. 1 Independent Company were tasked with defending the northeastern approaches to Australia, scattered in 9 sections through New Guinea, Buka, New Ireland and the Admiralties, the Solomons and the New Hebrides. Wilson's commandos were to remain behind enemy lines to gather and disseminate intelligence and assist and protect the coast watchers. Their key means of transport was the 80-ton MV Induna Star, which Wilson had purchased from her civilian owners in Rabaul and used to move detachments from Cavien to Rabaul for further transfer to Tulagi and Vila. In 1941, the Australian Department of Air took over weather reporting responsibilities in the area. The civilian organisation, already operating in New Guinea with a forecasting station at Port Moresby and an observing post at Salamaua, was significantly expanded with meteorological stations established in the Netherlands, East Indies, and at Vila and Noumea. In late September, F.O. J.L. Williams and Sergeant T.E. Hoare set up a weather station at the Gavutu Tanambogo locations of Tulagi AOB to supply meteorological information to the Catalinas operating from Port Moresby. Meanwhile, Major Wilson's commandos were experiencing boredom with the routine, which consisted mostly of aircraft maintenance and guard duty. Their only recreation was visiting Tulagi, shark fishing in Sea Lark Channel, or occasional excursions to Guadalcanal to shoot wild cattle on Tanaru Plantation for fresh beef. Each day the Catalinas would be airborne at dawn, making reconnaissance flights between Gavutu and Port Moresby, and occasionally transporting personnel. Paul Mason, the plantation manager who became a coast watcher in South Bougainville, was able to provide Tulagi with 2 hours advance warning of any Japanese aircraft heading for that area, allowing time to shift the Catalinas to Aola or Marau Sound on Guadalcanal for safety. Sometimes, as part of the private war preceding the main hostilities in the Solomons, an Aola-based Catalina would follow a Japanese flying boat back to the Maruki seaplane base at Simpson Harbour and attack as the plane was landing. Among those flying Catalina reconnaissance missions from the Tulagi Advanced Base were 2 Americans. In November 1941, U.S. Navy Lieutenant George H. Hutchinson and Samuel P. Weller, members of an observer team attached to the American Embassy in Canberra, were on temporary duty with the Royal Australian Air Force, Hutchinson with No. 11 Squadron and Weller with No. 20 Squadron. The 2 U.S. Navy Patrol Wing 10 veterans were the only Americans to fly with the Australians in the first weeks of the Pacific War, and they have the distinction of being the first U.S. servicemen to set foot in the Solomon Islands during World War II. In May 1941, a 333-man Australian garrison force, codenamed Robin Force, under Major D.G. Matheson arrived at Noumea, New Caledonia. 2 months later, the Australian Air Force established an advanced operational base at Noumea to support its patrol squadrons. Shortages of almost everything but whiskey were the norm, though to most people the war still seemed a long way off. Sister Mary Teresa, a Marist missionary on Guadalcanal, recalled, "During 1941 there was considerable talk about the possibility of war in the area, but it all sounded like rumours and eons away. Business went on as usual and life was lived in daily fashion. No one stopped to worry too much." At 0600 on the 9th of November 1941, the Commando No. 1 section departed Cavien for Rabaul in the Induna Star. On the 14th, the advance party flew from Rabaul to Tulagi by a Sunderland flying boat. Late on the 18th, the 16-man main party sailed in the Burns-Philp liner Malaita. They arrived at Tulagi 6 days later. For the defence of the islands, the commandos set up gun pits with 3 Vickers guns on anti-aircraft swivel mountings. One, on the seaward western side of the Tanambogo Hill, protected the bomb and fuel storage areas. The other 2, on the southern and western sides of the Gavutu Hill, covered the radio station. At the east end of the Tanambogo Hill was an old cemetery. The 3 solitary graves, which had fallen in, were used as slit trenches. A major task assigned to the No. 1 section was the formation and training of the Solomon Islands Defence Force on the same lines as the Papuan Infantry Battalion, with officers to be drawn from the white civilian population. Except for Martin Clemens, who was on leave, all the district officers and cadets had received appointments as second lieutenants effective the 16th of December 1941. 3 weeks later, the Defence Force welcomed its first commanding officer. Vivian Fox Strangways had been the resident commissioner-designate of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony, but 2 days after war was declared, Japanese forces occupied Makin Island in the northern Gilberts, and he could not assume his post. He was appointed a major and flown to Tulagi. The Solomon Islands Defence Force was perhaps the smallest army in the world. It consisted of 3 British officers, 1 British non-commissioned officer, NCO, 1 native warrant officer, WO, a handful of Chinese, and 112 Solomon Islanders. In an appreciation of the situation prepared for the resident commissioner, Fox Strangways lamented the force's poor state of readiness. The European ranks are in no sense fully trained. The standard of training and musketry of the native troops is low, and as yet no native NCO has any real grasp of fire direction and control, or of section leading. Tactical handling of troops, ammunition and ration supply, etc., has not been practiced. The force is composed chiefly of native police and their officers. Guard and police duties have obviously militated against training. The only hope lies in a simple, basic, flexible scheme of defence. Before active recruiting could begin, however, the Japanese swept into the South Pacific, and the training scheme collapsed under the press of time. The officer ranks of the Solomon Islands Defence Force were subsequently depleted by the evacuation of a number of government officials in February 1942. Among them was Fox Strangways, in command less than a month when he was ordered to Australia. By the beginning of March, the Defence Force had virtually disbanded. During the Japanese occupation, however, the force would be reconstituted around a cadre of skilled, experienced native constables, and by the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, it would earn an honoured place in military history. On the 8th of December 1941, Resident Commissioner Marchant at Tulagi learned via the BBC that Japanese troops had landed on the Malaya coast and that Pearl Harbor had come under air attack. Messages quickly were sent to residents with wireless sets. But more bad news followed. The Japanese had bombed Clark Field in the Philippines. The war had come to the Pacific. Almost immediately in the Southwest Pacific, preparations began to safeguard the women and children. The first evacuation was carried out by the Trienza, one of the Phosphate Commission's vessels, which served Nauru and Ocean Islands west of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, east of the Solomons. According to the diary of Father James Wall, the Marist priest who ministered to the Australian servicemen at the Tulagi Advanced Operational Base, the evacuation of Nauru's civilian population aboard the Trienza took place concurrently with the boarding of the Free French destroyer Le Triomphant. Father Wall records that after furnishing fuel, provisions and water to the warship at a secret location in the New Hebrides, the Trienza travelled north to Tulagi, where she remained for 3 days. Then, while docked at Lever's Plantations Pier at Gavutu, she boarded a number of European residents who had decided to evacuate, and subsequently sailed back to the New Hebrides and a rendezvous with Le Triomphant at Port Vila. Father Wall's account, however, clearly is incorrect. The Nauru evacuation had not occurred until the 23rd of February 1942. It is more likely that just after the outbreak of the Pacific War, the authorities diverted the Trienza to Tulagi for 3 days to evacuate civilians to Australia, particularly women and children, and that Father Wall later conflated the story with the evacuation of Nauru. Support for this explanation is found in the memoirs of Kenneth H. Dalrymple Hay, manager of the Burns, Philp Burandi estate on Guadalcanal. Dalrymple Hay recorded that his wife and all the other women on Tulagi apparently left without notice a few days before the 16th of December 1941, when he was scheduled to visit. They were evacuated on a ship that had been diverted while en route to the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, and as Ocean Island was part of that colony, the ship may have been the Trienza. The evacuation probably took place on the 12th of December. On the 11th of December, Purser Reginald Reg Bowley, AIF, who was stationed at Tulagi AOB, had noted in his diary that schooners are picking up all women and children to evacuate to Australia. In December 1941, the Methodist Mission's Synod was held at the head station Kokengolo on Roviana Island, New Georgia. Attending were Reverend Clarence T.J. Luxton from the Skotolan Mission Station on Buka and Reverend Donald C. Alley from the mission at Teop Island, northeast Bougainville. It was decided to lay up the Buka vessel, Saga, for copper resheathing, and the Bilua, the vessel from Vella La Vella, was temporarily assigned to Buka. On the day the Church Council ended, the attack on Pearl Harbor became known worldwide. Both Reverend Luxton and Alley immediately sailed in the Belua for Bougainville, 300 miles away. After stopping at Vella Lavella Island to pick up Alley's wife and 2 sons who had been visiting there, they hurried north at maximum speed, braving storms that would normally have kept the vessel in harbour. They arrived at Buka Passage on the 12th of December. Preparations for a feared Japanese invasion had begun. Assistant District Officer Jack Reed had already requested the use of the mission vessel if an evacuation order were issued, and shortly thereafter a native policeman brought a circular announcing that the New Guinea administration had ordered the evacuation of all European women and children from Buka and Bougainville. Nurses and missionaries could choose whether to remain, however, and that provision would create a problem for the coast watchers, as the Roman Catholic missionaries would elect to stay. Several planters also had refused to leave. People evacuating were to gather at the district headquarters station on Sohano Island in Buka Passage. At 0200 on the 19th of December, the Belua left Skotolan on Buka's west coast to pick up evacuees in that area. She boarded the first evacuees at dawn, later took on 4 nurses from the Marist mission, and then returned to Skotolan for Mrs. Luxton, her 2 small children, and Sister Elizabeth Common. One more person was picked up en route to Buka Passage. At Sohano Island, a launch arrived with Mrs. Alley and her children, and the missionaries spent the night aboard the Belua. At dawn on the 20th, the inter-island copra schooner Asakaze docked at Sohano with evacuees from Kieta, Bougainville. She boarded the Buka refugees, and at 0700 they set sail for Raboul. Shortly thereafter, they encountered one of the most vicious tropical storms ever recorded in that area. The trip, which should have taken only 24 hours, lasted 42. The terrified passengers had no accommodations, only blankets spread on the deck and hatches. Finally, at midnight on the 21st of December, the Asakaze reached Raboul, and 29 shivering, water-soaked evacuees scrambled aboard the Burns Philby liner Macdui, which was leaving for Australia. One day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Burns Philp liner Malaita had departed Sydney for the Solomons with 76 passengers, including 7 Solomon Islanders returning home. After calling at Queensland ports, New Guinea's Port Moresby, and Samurai Island, the vessel arrived at Tulagi at 2200 on the 13th of December. She anchored overnight as shoreside work had ceased at 1800 in accordance with blackout regulations. On New Year's Day 1942, the Malaita docked at small Macambo Island, just north of Tulagi within the Tulagi harbour. 6 people disembarked, 3 of whom immediately booked return passage to Australia on the Burns Philp Marinda, then en route from Sydney. The Malaita departed Macambo on the 2nd of January, making port calls through the Protectorate and Bougainville, and arriving at Raboul, New Britain, on the 6th. 56 people boarded at Raboul, 2 returning Royal Australian Navy, RAN, personnel, 7 paying passengers, and 28 Japanese civilian internees locked in the hold with 19 AIF soldiers serving as guards. From Raboul, the Malaita returned through the islands, taking on single passengers at Numa Numa and Kieta, Bougainville, 4 at Faizy, Shortland Islands, 21 at Gizo, 1 at Ferrer, Santa Isabel, 3 in the Russell Islands at Cape Marsh, and 11 at Tulagi. The voyage was anything but uneventful. On the 9th of January, off Sorokan in northwest Bougainville, a roving Japanese flying boat bombed the Malaita. The ship came through unscathed, however, as the pilot had either poor eyesight or inadequate training. The Malaita docked at Sydney on the 26th with 98 jittery passengers. When the Malaita had docked at Faizy on the 4th of January on the way to Raboul, William M. Klotz had disembarked. Klotz was the acting manager for Shortland Islands Plantations Limited, which operated most of Burns Philp properties in the Shortlands. The air attacks on Raboul had begun, and Bill Klotz found general confusion and considerable nervousness amongst the Faizy residents. Once he settled his company's affairs, he became involved in the plans to evacuate the European civilians from the western district of the Protectorate. The Shortlands district officer, Alexander N.A. Nick Waddell, had been in his post barely 3 months since the 25th of September 1941. Upon his appointment, the district had been expanded to include Choiseul, as the Shortlands area was limited. However, the resident commissioner had failed to provide Waddell with a vessel to carry out his duties. In fact, Waddell had not been in the Shortlands long enough to acquire more than a fairly superficial knowledge of his district. Nevertheless, on the outbreak of war in the Pacific, Waddell had called a meeting of the European residents and made arrangements for air raid warnings, shelters, food and oil supplies, and the disposal of shipping in the event of an attack. He apprised the local native headmen of the situation and obtained their cooperation in providing lookouts and runners and instituting reporting procedures. Nick Waddell was then a second lieutenant in the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Defence Force, BSIPDF, and had only himself and 8 native constables for the security of his district. In all, they had 90 rounds of rifle ammunition. Waddell had submitted several requisitions for more, but these had not been filled. 3 civilians had volunteered to join the defence force: Alfred Valentine Val Murphy, manager of the Burns Philp branch at Fazy, Ernest Mapletoft, Murphy's assistant, and Bill Klotz, but they were not accepted. Apparently, Resident Commissioner Marchant wanted only district officers and other members of the civil establishment to be involved. One of District Officer Waddell's immediate concerns was the safety of the remaining European women in his district. The Protectorate government had indeed advised dependents to leave, but unlike the Australians, it had not compelled them to do so. Clara Scott, Emily Cruikshank, and Louise Billette, all single and of middle age, had lived in the Shortlands for years. Their plantations were both their home and their livelihood, and they were reluctant to abandon them. However, Waddell managed to convince the women that relocating to Australia was preferable to having the Imperial Japanese Navy as a neighbour. In the meantime, following up on her initial successes, Japan had moved to secure bases in the Bismarck Archipelago and New Guinea. Rabaul, New Britain, was of key importance. On the 4th of January 1942, aircraft of the 24th Air Flotilla under Rear ADM Eiji Oto, from the Japanese naval base at Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, bombed Rabaul's 2 main airdromes, Lakunai and Guadalcanal. Further raids followed, and then, on the 20th, a flight of more than 100 planes, heavy bombers, dive bombers and fighters, struck the Australian base. The next day, 40 fighters and 20 dive bombers attacked Kavieng, New Ireland. A number of commandos were wounded, some later died. The Japanese must have thought that the town was heavily fortified to have mounted such a raid. The invasion force was already en route. On the 17th of January, Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Detachment, Nankai Shitai, having taken Guam, boarded their transports and sailed for Rabaul. Hori's unit, which was under the control of the 4th Fleet, was a brigade-sized force of some 5,300 men. It comprised the 144th Infantry, an engineer regiment, and elements of the Maizuru 2nd Special Naval Landing Force. Based on pre-war intelligence, staunch resistance was expected, but the Nankai Shitai was 5 times the size of Rabaul's garrison, and the Japanese general had no doubt of the outcome. Hori's brigade landed at Rabaul on the morning of the 23rd of January. The defenders were simply overwhelmed. Scattered pockets of resistance were quickly crushed. To avoid further slaughter, the Australian commander, Colonel J.J. Scanlon, surrendered. As soon as Rabaul was in Japanese hands, patrols were dispatched to hunt down any men who had escaped into the jungle. Many were not allowed to surrender and were simply massacred. Rabaul became a large prison compound where AIF soldiers, the diggers, would face starvation, ill treatment, slavery, and death. Rabaul was to be the central base for the Japanese conquest of the South Pacific, and they wasted no time in expanding their presence on New Britain. On the 28th of January, the 7th Construction Unit, CU, commanded by Engineering Officer Gonji Tokunaga, a civilian, began work on the reconstruction of the Lakunai airstrip. The conquerors of Rabaul planned to occupy the whole of New Britain before the end of January. On the 23rd of January, part of the South Seas detachment had shifted to attack Cavieng, New Ireland. Their landing barges reached the western beaches at 0305, and the few remaining residents scattered for safety. The Japanese captured the town with only 12 shots fired. Cavieng was occupied by the main body of the Kure 3rd Special Naval Landing Force, supported by weapons from the 5th Base Force. The 12th Construction Unit was assigned to build the base facilities and 5 lookout posts for the station. The bombing of Rabaul led to the belief that Kieta, on the east coast of Bougainville, was next in line for conquest. On the 22nd of January, the Kieta district officer, J.I. Merrilees, informed his headquarters in Australia that indeed the town had been attacked, and that he intended to destroy the wireless station and evacuate immediately. That day, the following handbill was distributed to residents and posted in prominent locations. In view of the broadcast that a military attack was launched on New Guinea today, and that we have been unable to get in touch with headquarters, citizens of Kieta, including public servants, have decided to abandon their post and leave as soon as possible, probably Friday, the 23rd of January, by local shipping for the mainland. If you wish to join the party, proceed with all speed to Kieta, bringing clothing and bedding. Rations will be provided. The report caused a panic. Terrified that the enemy was at their doorstep, the majority of the European residents frantically made preparations to flee in any seaworthy vessel they could find. But in fact, the attack was just a reconnaissance by 2 Japanese flying boats that had flown over Kieta. The real trouble occurred after most of the residents had departed, when islanders began looting the town. Eventually they were stopped by a small band of loyal native police, but it was too late. The damage was done. Merrilees' false report would bring chaos and disorder to every community in the Solomons and lead to the hurried exodus of island residents, many under duress. At about 14:30 on the 23rd of January, Merrilees, along with some other nervous residents, left Kieta in the Herald, a ketch owned by local Chinese merchant Wong Yu. They were headed for Toimonapu plantation down the coast. Immediately after their departure, Wong Yu sent a message to John R. Keenan, a patrol officer on Bougainville. "I just to let you know this morning have about 30 Japanese ships in Rabaul, think no too good. Today, 30 all-white people went to Buin by my boat. The radio station at Kieta set on fire before Mr. Doherty, H. Doherty, the Kieta wireless operator, left. I think it's better you gone with Mr. Taylor, J.L. Taylor, the assistant district officer. So I am sending you 3 batteries so you will get some news later when all radio stations are off, no on air. Hoping to meet you all someday again." En route to Toimonapu, Merrilees' party met Reverend Luxton in the Bilua. It is unclear whether the Reverend had returned to the Skolan mission station after leaving on 7 or the 8th of December with Reverend Ali, though it would appear to be the case, as District Officer Merrilees met him on the 23rd of January aboard the Bilua. Having heard the report on the 22nd that the Japanese were at Kieta, Luxton had left the Skolan mission and set out for Buin, at the southern tip of Bougainville. Merrilees transferred to the Bilua, which was much larger and in better condition than the Herald, and could take his group well out of the area. Thus he sent the Herald back to Kieta with her native crew. At Toimonapu, Merrilees found Tom Ebery, the plantation manager, and confiscated his teleradio equipment. Doherty, the wireless operator, then sent the message to Port Moresby that the Japanese had landed at Kieta. Ebery later told Paul Mason, manager of the Enos plantation east of Bougainville, that Merrilees and his group stayed at the plantation house that night and heard the Australian radio announce the enemy occupation of Kieta. It seemed certain that the town had really been seized, but then one of the men remarked, "Don't be silly, that's only what we told them." District Officer Nick Waddell at Faizi did not learn about the supposed invasion of Kieta until about 17:30 on the 25th of January, when he chanced to hear the news on an Australian Broadcasting Commission War News bulletin. Waddell tried to raise Kieta on his teleradio, but Merrilees was already at sea, and the Kieta line was dead. The Japanese had monitored the broadcast, but apparently thought the report was a deception. Because all the war news was under strict censorship, Protectorate residents lacked the information necessary to separate fact from fiction. At the Tulagi Air Base, with the breakdown of the Defence Force training plan, the Australian role became purely one of insular defence. With 24 Hells Islands, 3 Vickers anti-aircraft guns, and 1 Bren gun, a light machine gun, LMG, the commandos undertook the protection of the Catalina base at Tanambogo and the RAF radio station on Gavutu. Back on the 9th of January, when the air raids began, Reg Bowley at Gavutu had captured the excitement and frustration in his diary. Big scare, the game's on, Japanese planes overhead, didn't have a chance of a shot. NCO Claude Sinclair, general storekeeper in charge of the bomb dump and assistant in the Marine section, recalled that one bomb that hit Gavutu left a hole 42 feet wide and 8 feet deep. That game began in earnest about 12:30 on the 22nd of January, when a Japanese Mavis flying boat attacked Gavutu. All the bombs landed in Tulagi harbour, missing the base by hundreds of feet, before the raider turned his machine guns on a Catalina, A-25, that was moored off Tanambogo. As her captain, P.O. Alan L. Norman, fought to get his engines started, the gunners on shore fired at the low-flying Japanese. Finally, the Cat got underway and skimmed along the water, zigzagging until Norman was able to get airborne and elude his attacker by sliding into a cloud bank. The islanders had a 2-day respite before the next episode. On the 24th, 2 flying boats bombed Tulagi, then hit a small pier in Chinatown and flew off. The raid made people edgy. They realized the war was coming closer and much sooner than they had expected. Over the next 4 months, the bombings would gradually increase in both size and frequency, and the Tulagi air base would become a rather dangerous place. Amazingly, no one was killed. So many attacks occurred on Tulagi that the Japanese bombardiers appeared to be completely incompetent. Their frequent attempts to knock down the wireless antenna were unsuccessful, and the town was rarely damaged. More likely, the Japanese wanted the area to be relatively intact when they took it. On the 23rd of January, the day before the flying boats had bombed Tulagi, Burns Philp Plantation's manager Bill Klotz, under instructions from Nick Waddell, went to Lamona Plantation on Purupuru Island aboard the cutter Lofung to pick up the owners, Catherine and Wilson Atkinson. Kitty Atkinson was eager to evacuate, but Willie refused and Klotz had to leave without him. The cutter arrived at Fazy about 8 o'clock on the 24th with Kitty Atkinson, Clara Scott, Emily Cruikshank and Louise Billette, who were then sent to Gizo in the Ramada, the schooner on loan to Waddell from the district officer at Guadalcanal. By the time Klotz returned to Lamona a day later, Willie Atkinson had heard the Australian broadcast of the Japanese landing at Kieta, and he was more than eager to leave. He realized that even his brother Sam, who owned Balal Island, had left earlier. Willie packed a few belongings and sailed for Fazy, arriving about 4 o'clock on the 26th. Waddell told Klotz that the situation was dire and strongly suggested he start for Gizo immediately. After unloading some unwanted 44-gallon drums of diesel oil, Klotz had just enough time to visit the Lofung store, the hospital, and the office on the beach, telling the native labourers to help themselves to any remaining rations. He then picked up Eric J. Slim Summerland, a Burns Philp employee, and Father George M. Lepping of the Marist Mission Station at Neela, Poperang Island. At about 5 o'clock on the 26th, with Willie Atkinson, Slim Summerland and Father Lepping, Bill Klotz set out for Gizo in the Lofung. In the midst of all this activity and confusion, a native canoe pulled in at Fazy. Father Richard O'Sullivan, from the Marist Mission Station at Patupatnai near Buin on Bougainville Island, had come to Fazy to do some shopping. On hearing of the Shortland Islands evacuation order, he immediately climbed aboard his canoe once again and headed back to Bougainville. At 18 o'clock on the 26th, Waddell received an urgent telegram from the resident commissioner instructing him to burn all secret documents and destroy all stores. Waddell objected, as they had already made preparations to remain, and he was still awaiting news from his scouts on Bougainville. The only report on the fall of Quieta had come from the Australian radio broadcast, which the administration at Tulagi apparently had taken at face value. However, at 2 o'clock on the 27th of January, Waddell received a message from Resident Commissioner Marchant ordering him to carry out the instructions immediately and proceed to Gaizo in the Ramada, which was being returned to him. Nick Waddell ordered the remaining Europeans to proceed to Gaizo. He and Val Murphy, the Burns-Philp manager, remained behind to complete the destruction of Fazy. They arranged the repatriation of the native labourers from the various plantations to their home islands and saw that they were provided with ample food. Much of the food from the Burns-Philp warehouse and all medical supplies were distributed to responsible local people to minimise any immediate looting and shortage. The islanders were instructed to proceed to Fowro Island using all available launches, including those belonging to Burns-Philp, Eric Monkton, Emily Cruikshank, and the Kamalii plantation. After putting the warehouse and any remaining stores to the torch, the two men sailed for Gaizo in the Ramada. The Shortland settlement, 36 years in the making, was left in ruins. The evacuation plan called for the Fazy residents to reassemble at Gaizo Island, and District Officer Waddell expected to remain there until receiving further instructions. But at that moment, when prompt communication was imperative, the administration, slow at the best of times, was dead on its feet. Waddell did not know that Resident Commissioner Marchant had ordered the destruction of the settlement at Gaizo. The Gaizo district officer, William H.C.C. Hugh Miller, had been Nick Waddell's immediate predecessor in the Shortlands. Due to retire within a year, he was expecting the arrival of a cadet to replace him. He would have a long time to wait. The Australian Broadcasting Commission report of the fall of Quieta had caused turmoil and confusion at Gaizo Station, as it did throughout the Protectorate. The Central Solomons were the next step from the Shortlands, which were only 50 miles from Quieta. The description of the evacuation of Gaizo and the Central Solomons is based on several sources. The most detailed is an undated report summarising the events from the 23rd of January to the 5th of February 1942, written by District Officer Hugh Miller for the Resident Commissioner. Another important source is The Cruise of the Fowro Chief, a mimeographed account compiled by Reverend Arthur H. Voice from the Journal of Dr. Alan G. Rutter, and the diaries of Sisters Vera Cannon, Lena Jones, and Effie Harkness, all from the Methodist Mission. Rutter was a medical missionary, and Cannon was a nurse at the mission hospital at Bilua in southeast Vella La Vella. Jones and Harkness were teachers at Congolo. Reverend Voice, a missionary at Buin, would return to the Solomons in 1943 as a chaplain with the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force. According to the participant accounts, at about 0900 on the 23rd of January, Dr. Rutter and Sister Cannon, hearing news of the Japanese advance, paddled over to Leopari Estate to confer with the manager, A.W. Burt Bourne, and his wife Monica, about the possibility of awakening a slumbering Tulagi into some active evacuation or assisting the residents to leave. At midday, Rutter and the Bournes went to Gaizo in the mission launch Sicily II to inquire about evacuation plans should the Japanese move towards the Solomons. They found the entire population, European and native, digging trenches. At 1400, a meeting was held in Fred Green's store with the following attendees: Green, Rutter, James Kidney, manager of Burns-Philp's branch at Gaizo and agent for the Shell Company, the Bournes, Ernie Mapletoft and his wife Tony, and Hugh Miller and his wife Margarine. Although everyone seemed in favour of taking action, there was no agreement on what to do. District Officer Miller suggested that the mission sisters congregate at Bilua, that the Methodist mission schooner Fowro Chief be held in readiness, and that if the Japanese moved toward the Solomons, the residents should evacuate eastward and, if possible, join the Seventh-day Adventist mission staff at their large station at Batuna, Vangunu Island, New Georgia. Bourne and Rutter suggested a rendezvous at Congolo to prepare the Fowro Chief for a possible trip. Satisfied that something was being done, they returned to Vella La Vella about 2100. 90 minutes earlier, on the 23rd of January, the Australian Broadcasting Commission announced that Quieta had fallen. Various writers indicate that Kidney and the Mapletofts came to see Miller about the evacuation. Because Miller felt that the district schooner, Gizo, should remain at the station, Kidney offered the Burns-Philp launch, Marovo, for their use. It was agreed that the Mapletofts and Mrs. Miller would leave for Kokengolo via Kolombangara as soon as possible to avoid detection by any Japanese entering Gizo at dawn. After advising the Kongolo mission staff of what had occurred, they would proceed to Batuna to persuade the Seventh-day Adventists to hold their schooner, Melanesia, as the Faro chief could not accommodate all who were leaving. Miller immediately sent the Gizo to Bilua with a message for Reverend A.W.E. Sylvester, telling him to come in without delay. After packing, the group met at 2300 at the Burns-Philp store, where Kidney had nearly finished loading food supplies on the Marovo. At that time, Rutter heard the news about Kieta and rushed over in pyjamas and slippers to inform Sylvester and Sister Cannon. On the track, he met a native messenger from Gizo with a note from Hugh Miller, asking that all the Europeans from Bilua and its surroundings be at Gizo by 0200 on the 24th of January. This seemed too indefinite, so Rutter and Bert Bourne returned to Gizo aboard the Gizo, arriving at 0300. There they learned that the Marovo would be leaving for Kokengolo 3 hours later. No reply had been received from Tulagi, so no help was anticipated. They would have to rely on local efforts. The writings show that Bourne and Rutter had returned in the Burns-Philp launch Loai to collect the people at Bilua. Reverend Sylvester dispatched a runner to Mundi Mundi Plantation for John Campbell and his family, then sent the Sicily II to Sassamunga, Choiseul, for Reverend John R. Metcalf and Sister Merle S. Farland, instructing them to head directly to Roviana. Charles P. Beck and Mrs. Jean McEachran were brought over from Ozama, a tiny island just off Bilua. The Marovo left Gizo at daylight on the 24th of January with the Mapletofts, Mrs. Miller, and Mr. J. Gosling, a Seventh-day Adventist employee. The vessel was accompanied by the small Burns-Philp launch, Vonunu, which was to return and let Miller know whether the Seventh-day Adventist people at Batuna would wait. About 0700, the two boats were seen passing down the coast of Kolombangara. An hour later, the Loai left Bilua for Kokengolo, with Rutter, Beck, Mrs. McEachran, the Bournes, Sister Cannon, and Sister Grace MacDonald. Reverend Sylvester stayed behind. That morning of the 24th of January, Gizo District Officer Hugh Miller sent a radiogram to Tulagi. Residents of the district evacuating east. Kidney, Green and I await instructions. Resident Commissioner Marchant's terse reply was, "Suggest evacuees concentrate Batuna." With only the Gizo left for their escape, Miller had no means of forwarding this message to those who had already gone. The participant reports state that the Marovo arrived first in Kongolo. The news from Gizo took the residents by surprise, but by the time the Loai arrived, preparations for departure had begun. The writers indicate that those at Kongolo had made preparations previously to go bush, as they had not thought evacuation possible. However, it seemed wiser to depart, as Tulagi was being bombed, and if that town were evacuated, it would mean no more provisions, medicines, or other supplies. They realized they would have to live in the bush to avoid internment or worse, and knew they would be a burden to the native people, who could protect themselves. Additionally, Grace MacDonald and Lena Jones were ill and in need of care. With heavy and sad hearts, the reports state, the mission residents made their preparations, reflecting on their life's work and arranging as much as possible for it to be carried on by the islanders. The Marovo and her passengers quickly moved out again for Batuna to prevent the Melanesia from leaving before everyone had gathered there. Provisions from the Loai were transferred to the Faro chief, plenty of crude oil fuel was put on board, and the vessel was prepared as well as possible for the long voyage to Australia. Early that evening of the 24th of January, the Salicana, the auxiliary cutter from the Solomon Islands Development Company's Manning Strait plantation, arrived at Gizo with copra from Burns-Philp. Under the circumstances, Kidney, the company's manager, had no use for it. Thus, District Officer Miller sent the vessel back with an urgent letter to the estate manager, Herbert S. Brearley, telling him that Quieta had been occupied and that he should leave for Tulagi immediately. That day, Miller sent another radiogram to the resident commissioner. "Everybody gone? Do we remain?" Merchant replied, "Collaborate with agent Mr. Kidney and take steps to demolish RAAF petrol in case of attack." The participant accounts indicate that the Ramada, with Clara Scott, Catherine Atkinson, Emily Cruikshank, and Louise Billette, arrived at Gizo around 1600 on the 24th of January. The women recounted the day and night reconnaissance by Japanese planes over the Shortland Islands. They were quickly transferred to the Loai, which had just returned from Kongolo, and were instructed to head for Batuna with all speed to relay the resident commissioner's instructions to the Seventh-day Adventist staff. The Ramada returned immediately to the Shortlands. The writers note that at 0625 on the 26th of January, District Officer Waddell at Fazy failed to keep a radio telegraph session. District Officer Miller's routing of his own communications to Auki, the chief port on Malaita, led him to suspect that the Shortlands had been occupied and Tulagi evacuated. Then, at 0930, the Campbell family from Mundi Munda and William J. Binskin from Baga Island, off southwest Vella La Vella, arrived at Gizo in Binskin's ketch, Alice, with 2 Japanese internees, Sananga and Pisita. It is noted that John Campbell, on his own initiative, had carried out a scorched earth policy, destroying his rubber trees and stores. The writers added that, because Gizo would be overcrowded, District Officer Miller kept the internees on board the Alice, under escort, and instructed Campbell to head for Batuna and hold there for the Fauro chief and the Melanesia. Miller and Kidney had already begun demolition preparations. At 2200 on the 26th of January, Waddell still had not arrived at Gizo, and Miller concluded that the Shortlands indeed had been occupied and Waddell had failed to escape. Believing that Gizo would be attacked by dawn, Miller, Kidney and Green agreed to demolish the petrol and evacuate. The stock of petrol consisted of 250 44-gallon drums, kept in a bond store on the Burns-Philp wharf, less than 100 feet from the Burns-Philp store and copra shed. Miller and Kidney opened the drums, some completely, some just enough to allow the fumes to seep out. A coconut leaf trail had been laid and saturated with paraffin. It was saturated a second time, and then, at 23:30, as the moon was failing, Miller set it afire. Participant writings show that the 3 men left Gizo immediately. Due to the darkness, however, they had to anchor at Nusatupi, a small island off the entrance to Gizo harbour. There they met the Vanunu, returning from Batuna. In a letter from his wife, Miller learned that the Fauro chief and the Melanesia were heading for Australia, though the latter vessel would first stop at Gill Island, off the north coast of Santa Isabel, to pick up Pastor J. Howes. District Officer Miller also received a request from Pastor J.C.H. Perry, Superintendent of the Seventh-day Adventist Mission, broadcast a message to Howes. "Meet me according to arrangements." At 0500 on the 27th of January, what appeared to be the copra shed burst into flames. The glow could be seen for miles. Fearing that it would draw the Japanese, the Gizo and the Vonunu set out immediately for the coast of Kolombangara. An hour later they met up with the Salikana, coming from the direction of Gizo. Leaving word with the Vanunu to have the Salikana meet them at Lady Lever Plantation on Kolombangara, Miller and his party proceeded there. By that time, dense black smoke could be seen rising from Gizo. Meanwhile, after anchoring in Viru harbour for the night, the participants state that the Fauro chief had left early on the 26th for the Seiji Plantation in the southern part of New Georgia Island, home of long-time resident Harold A. Markham. Markham gave the evacuees his sextant and some navigation books, but was not very hopeful of their success. As they were about to leave Segi, the Loai caught up with them, with the 4 women from the Shortlands aboard. She then continued on to Batuna. The Fauro chief went to Patutiva, the largest of the Methodist mission villages in the Marovo Lagoon, where the Europeans obtained potatoes and pineapples for the long trip. They reached Batuna at 1500, and found the Seventh-day Adventist mission staff preparing to leave in Melanesia. The Mapletofts, Mrs. Miller and Mr. Gosling arrived just in time to join the other evacuees. A crew of 8 Solomon Islanders, all skilled mariners, usually handled the Faro chief, but they could not leave the protectorate. So on this voyage she would not have a qualified sailor. Because the Melanesia was larger and the Faro chief lacked able-bodied men, the two exchanged some passengers. According to the reports, the Mapletofts joined those of the Faro chief, and Mrs. Miller, Mrs. McEachran, and the 4 women from the Shortlands went aboard the Melanesia with the Adventist men. The Faro chief passengers were glad to have Ernie Mapletoft aboard, as only Bert Bourne had some ocean sailing experience, and he and Charles Beck would have been overworked. That night they had hurriedly finished packing when the news broadcast from Australia announced, "All citizens have been evacuated from Tulagi. The Melanesia left first, at 0115 on the 27th. While preparations were being completed on the Faro chief, a launch arrived with the Campbell family, also going to Tulagi. Campbell told them of the scorched earth policy that Miller had carried out at Gizo, that Sister Farland was not coming, and that Reverend Luxton had gone to Kieta to help evacuate people, and most probably had been caught by the Japanese. Campbell said he could not have made the trip to Batuna, about 80 miles from his estate, without the help of the 2 Japanese internees, who had piloted him through the reefs and dangerous passages. He relayed Miller's request that they wait at Batuna until 1400 and then go up to Auki. However, Dr. Rutter would not alter his arrangements. The reports show that final preparations were made, and the Faro chief left Batuna at 0800. Aboard her were Rutter, Beck, Reverend E.C. Ledley from Congolo, Sisters Cannon, Harkness, Jones and MacDonald, Ernie and Tony Mapletoft, and Bert and Monica Bourne. Rutter asked Campbell not to radio the resident commissioner that they had sailed. Writing again on the 27th of January, the participants note that Bill Klotz and his party, in the Lofong, reached Gizo that day, shortly before Nick Waddell and his group in the Ramada. They found the town abandoned and in smoking ashes. Waddell had seen the fire and smoke en route from Fazy. Perplexed because they had not received further orders from the government by radio, Klotz's party set off for Batuna to await evacuation instructions. District Officer Miller reached Lady Lever Plantation about 0800 that morning and found the plantation unoccupied. Soon afterward, however, writings show the arrival of Edward Shields, overseer of Lever's Vila estate. Harold Mulvey, manager of the firm's estates on Columbangara, had not heard Gizo on the air that morning and had sent Shields to investigate. Mulvey and his remaining assistant, James A. Buchanan, were at Port Vila, ready to evacuate. Herbert Brearley, in the Salicana, came into the Lady Lever plantation soon after, reporting 2 other vessels following. The first turned out to be the Lofung, with Klotz, Atkinson, Summerland and Father Lepping. The second was the Ramada, with Waddell and Murphy. Waddell had on board a number of Solomon Islanders, who were to be put off at the Roviana Lagoon, and thus it was decided that the Lofung would proceed to Port Vila, collect Mulvey and Buchanan, and then head for Batuna via the eastern coast of New Georgia. The Gizo, Ramada and Salicana proceeded to Batuna via Roviana. The Salicana was sent to Tetipari on New Georgia Island to pick up a planter, Francis Thresher. District Officer Miller then transferred to the Ramada to try to get a wireless message through to Tulagi and sent the Gizo on to Batuna. However, he was unable to rig the wireless aerial. Records indicate they therefore proceeded to Markham's plantation at Segi, arriving at 0130 on the 28th. At Segi they found the vessels congregated, as it was too dark to go on to Batuna. There they learned that the Melanesia and the Faro chief had departed, the former to Santa Isabel, the latter to Australia. Miller then sailed at 0500 for Gill Island via Batuna, where he found the Salicana. Leaving word that Waddell would get there later, Miller carried on to Gili Island, arriving at 2100. The Melanesia and the Loweye were anchored there, and on the Melanesia, in addition to Pastor Perry and Mr. Gosling, were Pastors A.R. Barrett and J. Cormack, Nurse Evelyn Totenhofer, C. Tucker, Norman A. Ferris, Mrs. Atkinson, Mrs. Cruikshank, Miss Billette, Mrs. Scott, and Mrs. Miller. Pastor Perry told District Officer Miller that they intended to make for Australia, but they had come to Gili Island first to meet Pastor Howes. On the Loei were John and Florence Campbell and their 3 children on their way to Auki. Early the next morning, the 29th of January, participant writings show that Pastor Howes arrived at Gili Island. Pastor Perry decided to return to Batuna in Howes's vessel, the Dadavata. The Melanesia would carry on up the Choiseul coast in the hope of meeting Pastor C. Pascoe, who they thought would try to escape from Bougainville via the islands in the Bougainville Straits. Privately, District Officer Miller had urged the Shortlands women and Mrs. McEachran not to undertake a dangerous ocean voyage in such a small vessel. He convinced them to come with his party to Tulagi and take passage on the Marinda, which was being sent directly to the Solomons on an evacuation run, and thus they and Mrs. Miller were distributed among the Gizo, Loei, and Dadavata. The 3 vessels left Gili Island at 10:45 on the 29th and reached Batuna the next morning, the 30th. Miller radioed Resident Commissioner Marchant that he had intercepted Melanesia and returned with the women, and that the Faro chief had departed for Australia. Before leaving for Gili Island, however, Miller had asked a native teacher at Batuna to proceed to Gizo on an errand. Returning on the 30th of January, the teacher reported that when he had arrived at Gizo Island at midnight on the 28th, he saw no one on Gizo, but a fire was burning fiercely at Burns Philp, and the bond store that had contained the petrol was gone. Then, at midday on the 29th, while at the Adventist Mission Hospital at Kukadu, on Kolombangara, he saw a plane flying low over the island and then heard 4 loud explosions. District Officer Waddell reported that the male Europeans had become restive about their evacuation, and he feared a serious disturbance if they received no immediate or definite instructions. He and Miller radioed the resident commissioner about their concern. On February 1st, they received instructions to send the evacuees to Tulagi in Melanesia. However, since the Melanesia was not at Batuna, they prepared the Gizo along with 6 other cutters and launches, and the evacuees departed for the Solomons capital at 14 o'clock. Later that afternoon, Miller was instructed to send the internees, Sananga and Pisita, to Tulagi. They, along with their escorts, left in a Seventh-day Adventist mission vessel at 19 o'clock. Returning from Isabel that evening, Pastor Perry volunteered to take the Malaita labourers from the Morovo Lagoon plantations to Tulagi. Corporal Surita of the Solomon Defence Force was dispatched in one of the vessels to collect them. Although he promised to wait at the top end of the lagoon until midnight, Perry left Batuna at 22 o'clock. Surita did not return until the next day with all 28 labourers, having had to search for them, causing them to miss Pastor Perry. Participants write that the Ramada returned from Choiseul the evening of February 2nd, with Reverends Sylvester and Metcalfe, Sister Farland, and Father Albert Benoit of the Marist Mission. The following afternoon, the 3 Methodist missionaries decided not to evacuate, and thus returned to Kokengolo in Reverend Belshazzar Gina's boat. The Malaita labourers were sent to Tulagi in an Adventist mission vessel. Reverend Sylvester and Sister Farland returned to Vella La Vella, while Metcalfe remained at Kongolo. Father Benoit returned to Choiseul in the Lofong. On the afternoon of February 4th, District Officer Miller received a message from the Resident Commissioner. "Do you wish to remain in your district for intelligence?" District Officer Waddell, who was nearby, assumed that the message also pertained to him. Both men declined, their stations lay in ashes, and nothing could be accomplished by remaining. In response, Resident Commissioner Marchant instructed them to proceed to Tulagi, and thus they left Batuna for the Solomons capital on the Ramada at 23:15. For the most part, the Chinese residents of Miller's district had evacuated with all their stores and provisions between January 8th and 12, moving from place to place in their vessels. On January 26th, when the Australian Broadcasting Commission announced that Tulagi had been evacuated, and with Marinda not due for almost 2 weeks, the Leavers plantation staff quickly put into effect its own evacuation plan. The company Ketch Kombito collected those wishing to leave, and transferred them to the large labour recruiting vessel, the 300-ton Curimarao, for the trip to Australia. Fortunately, those who missed being picked up due to lack of knowledge or lateness were granted a reprieve when Charles Witwidi, Lever's general manager at Gavutu Island, arranged for the Kombito to make additional stops and take them to meet the evacuation vessel in the Russell Islands. On January 27th, the Curimarao left the Solomons for Sydney with 73 passengers. A few smaller vessels fled south with her. The Fowro chief evacuees arrived safely in Mackay, Queensland, on February 11, 1942, after a voyage of 16 days. Charles Beck, elderly and very ill, was taken to a hospital immediately and died a few days later. The trip also faced some near disasters. 3 days into the voyage, Monica Bourne, who could not swim, fell overboard. Bert, her husband, also a non-swimmer, jumped in after her. Both were reportedly rescued. Later, the vessel experienced further distress when it became trapped inside a reef. After arriving in Australia, the Fowro chief was taken up by the Australian Navy and used as an examination ship for inspecting vessels entering port and checking for contraband and belligerent status. On May 16, 1945, at Milne Bay, New Guinea, she sank due to the collapse of the jetty alongside which she had been moored. The small fleet of refugees from New Georgia reached Tulagi safely and awaited Miranda's arrival from Sydney. District officers Nick Waddell and Hugh Miller joined the evacuees on February 5th. Meanwhile, Katarangoso, an ordained native pastor, was in charge of the Seventh-day Adventist mission vessels. At the request of District Officer Donald Kennedy, the Marara was turned over to Hugh Wheatley, a native medical practitioner on Kennedy's staff. Wheatley used the vessel for 2 weeks in repatriating plantation workers from the Central Solomons to their home islands. Kennedy then took charge of the vessel. A man of forceful personality and strong character, Kennedy often operated almost independently. Having surmised that the Japanese would occupy key points in the Solomons, he began collecting supplies and hoarding essential items. The Miranda finally departed Sydney at 22:25 on January 31, 1942, refueled and reprovisioned, but 4 hours late. She had been short a third cook and could not sail until a replacement had been found. The ship had been chartered by the Australian government in response to a special request to the Prime Minister from the High Commissioner for the Western Pacific. On government instructions, the Naval Board sanctioned her use for this special voyage to evacuate those waiting at Tulagi. Miranda's usual route was via Lord Howe Island, Norfolk Island, Port Vila, Efate, Espiritu Santo and Tulagi, where she would dock at the Burns Philby Pier on adjacent Macambo Island. On this voyage, however, she sailed directly to Tulagi Island. On board was Cadet Martin Clemens, who had been on leave in Australia when the war broke out in the Pacific. He had planned to join the Royal Australian Navy while in Melbourne, but found that avenue closed, so he had to return to Tulagi when his leave ended. Had it not been for Vic Sherwin and Jack Blakey, who were also returning from leave, Clemens would have been the only passenger. Although the sea was calm, the crew was restless, and Miranda's master, Captain S. Rothery, was constantly talking, indicative of his nervousness. Despite his prattle, Rothery refused to provide any information to his 3 passengers, despite their constant prodding. What was the situation at Tulagi? Was it still intact? Their frustration with the captain notwithstanding, Clemens, Sherwin and Blakey were well served in the Miranda's lounge by the young purser, Harry Lukin, and the stewardess. Lukin had the unenviable job of defending the ship with the Vickers gun mounted atop her bridge. On February 5th, European residents from all parts of the Protectorate began arriving at Tulagi. Most of their cutters and schooners were scattered alongside the wharf at Macambo. Suitcases, trunks, government file boxes, cases of rifles, machine guns, ammunition, and even a load of copra were sitting on the dock awaiting the Miranda. The next day, Resident Commissioner Marchant appointed William V. Jardine Blake, the government accountant, as the evacuation officer. Blake was informed that the Miranda would arrive on the 7th, though the date was subject to change depending on clearance from Sydney. she would dock at her normal station at Macambo. In the event of an imminent air attack or favourable conditions, she would proceed to a sheltered area of Port Purvis, Florida Island, and when the danger had passed, she would move to Macambo to load. Blake began preparing the evacuation list and the boarding and loading plans. On the morning of February 8th, the Marinda steamed up between Guadalcanal and Florida Islands at about 10:20. It was not good scheduling. Burns-Philp had been warned to have her arrive at Tulagi either early in the morning or late in the afternoon, as Japanese flying boats usually appeared around midday. As the ship approached the port, an air raid warning was received on shore. Paul Mason, the coast watcher on Bougainville, had radioed that a Japanese Kawanishi flying boat was heading south. A crash boat met the Marinda in Tulagi Harbour. On board were several armed airmen and Pay Lieutenant Donald S. McFarlane, RAN, assigned as the port director. A recently recruited protégé of Eric Felt, organizer of the Coast Watchers, McFarlane was dressed in his starched white Navy uniform and wore a tin hat. Father James Wall, the missionary at Tulagi Advanced Operational Base, also came out in the Lever's Plantation sketch, The Combito. All had stern, worried looks. Although McFarlane was untrained in maritime responsibilities, until recently a department store supervisor, he issued orders to Marinda's captain to head for the Mboli Passage on Florida Island, where overhanging jungle growth would hide the ship from Japanese aircraft. The Marinda proceeded at a crawl. At about 11 o'clock, when she was 10 minutes away from Mboli Passage, the expected flying boat appeared out of the clouds and headed toward Tulagi. Rothery stopped the engines, and the old vessel became silent. Coming from the north, the Kawanishi sighted the target and began its bombing run. Marinda was a sitting duck. She resumed movement and began to swing away just as the bombs were released. Fortunately, the channel was wide enough for her to maneuver. Martin Clemens described the next few minutes as hell. The flying boat dropped 2 bombs from its left wing, then a few seconds later 2 more from the right wing. Clemens thought at least one might have his name on it, but all fell off the starboard bow. Circling again, the Kawanishi dropped 4 more bombs in a straight line 200 yards off but astern. It circled once more and then flew off to the north. The pilot did not use his machine guns on the milling boats, all loaded with evacuees. Relief was evident among the packed small vessels, as well as on the Marinda, for in her hold were 70 tons of explosives and aviation fuel for the Australians. If one bomb had hit, she would have been an inferno. The ship was now free to berth, and McFarlane ordered the captain to take her to Gavutu for loading. In doing so, however, he greatly exceeded his authority, as responsibility for the evacuation had been entrusted to Blake, a senior civil official. McFarlane was the Naval Liaison Officer, NLO. His responsibilities were primarily intermediation and information. Meanwhile, the evacuees were either on the Macambo wharf or on their craft in the harbour. The European passengers were concentrated in the general area of Macambo. The Chinese evacuees remained in Chinatown on Tulagi. When they saw Marinda heading for the Lever's Plantation's wharf, they began loading their belongings back onto their boats and headed for Gavutu. Dozens of vessels, schooners, cutters, ketches filled the harbour, all trying not to bump into one another and fighting for dock space. Blake, still on Tulagi, then went to the Macambo docks where all the government records remained, as well as the sacks of mail and boxes of rifles and ammunition. He hailed the resident commissioner's vessel, 38 Hells Islands Tulagi, and with help from others loaded the cash on her, then headed for Gavutu. On docking, Blake was given a message to attend a meeting at the air mess on Tanambogo. There he found McFarlane, Sherwin, Clemens, and Christopher S.B. Attlee discussing evacuation plans. But because Blake had already devised a strategy, it seemed appropriate to them to get the evacuees aboard accordingly. At 14:30, McFarlane handed Attlee a letter from Resident Commissioner Marchant, stating that Marinda would be leaving as soon as possible. 40 minutes later, Blake phoned the commissioner and was informed that the ship was indeed stopping at Macambo. About 16:15, however, Blake was told that she would not be coming to the Burns-Philp dock. McFarlane had interfered again. Captain Rothery was also making Blake's difficult job worse. When Blake arrived at Gavutu at 1750, he found widespread confusion. The first of the evacuees' vessels had reached Gavutu around 16 o'clock, but Rothery had refused to permit anyone to come aboard. Somewhat earlier, F.E. Pop Johnson, the Protectorate Treasurer and Collector of Customs, had arrived along with other evacuating officials. He too had been denied boarding rights by the obstinate captain, who had said that no person in the government had been over to see him about anything. Blake, as evacuation officer, had been trying to settle where the Marinda should be berthed and decide what action to take to protect the government records, and he had brought the evacuation list with him. But in the meantime, Rothery had decided to permit the boarding of some evacuees who had arrived unexpectedly that morning from New Guinea, 6 Australian commandos attached to the detachment in the Namatanai sub-district, New Ireland, which had evacuated the Namatanai area. The 6 commandos had been in mountainous country inside Japanese lines with District Officer Bill Kyle. Unable to raise anyone at Port Moresby or headquarters through their teleradio, they had nowhere to go and no instructions to follow. They were tired and suffering from fatigue, malaria, dysentery, and skin infections. They had obtained the use of the diesel-powered MV Niar to make their way from New Guinea to Tulagi. Among those leaving aboard the Marinda were Fred Green and Douglas Trotter, who had departed desolate Quieta on the 26th of January and made their way to Tulagi by island hopping in a small boat. They had carried with them the Quieta government records, which District Officer Merrilees supposedly had destroyed, as well as the last mail from Bougainville. Later they would learn that their cargo had been left on the dock at Gavutu. Another passenger was Jeff Gaskell, whose brother Jack had already sailed for Australia in the Kurimura. Jeff, who worked for Burns Phillip at Macambo, was a member of the Protectorate Defence Force and thus was put in charge of the Vickers gun on Marinda's forecastle deck. His father, Dick, was also on the passenger list. Some remaining cargo on the Macambo docks was transported to Gavutu. It was normal for the prisoners from the Tulagi stockade to offload incoming ships and then load outboard cargo. But these were not normal times. All prisoners were on parole and not available for a work detail, except for a few who were still held in the jail because of the severity of their crimes. Some island workers from Levers, along with members of the South Sea Evangelical Mission and the Commandos, thus joined to unload Marinda's cargo. Many boxes had to be put aboard as well, including guns and ammunition. However, the ship's derricks were rigged over the port side, the side farther from the wharf, and the captain and the mate refused to switch them to the wharf position. The mate agreed to accept only what would be hand-carried aboard, but none of the ship's 61 crew members would assist. With darkness falling and the 22 o'clock blackout in force, it was impossible to distinguish one carton from another, and the government files could not be sorted systematically and stacked. In addition, the copra was left on the wharf, a loss to some unfortunate planter. The captain was also obstinate about how many passengers he would carry. He checked the list and refused to take anyone in excess of the number allowed by the Navigation Acts. It was explained to him that a Union Company ship, certified to carry 50 passengers, had taken 350 from Tonga to Fiji, and a ship capable of carrying a few dozen had left Singapore with 2,500. But nothing moved the stubborn shipmaster. He stood at the top of the gangway counting noses, boarding only women and children and men accompanied by their wives. When the resident commissioner arrived from Tulagi, Rothery told him that he would not take the people remaining unless a lifeboat was supplied. Since no such boat was available, 28 civilians, including 9 Chinese and 11 Europeans, and 4 officials remained behind. It was about then, at 21 o'clock, that Lieutenant A. Wilson, who was standing at the head of the gangway, pointed out to Lieutenant McFarlane, the newly appointed port director, that some government records were still on the dock. In fact, one case had just fallen off. McFarlane simply replied, "The ship must sail." 10 minutes later, the Marinda pulled away from the Levers dock and headed for the open sea. The case that had fallen into the water was actually a mailbag full of thousands of British Solomon Islands stamps, part of the shipment of post office property being sent to Australia for safekeeping. Sometime after the Marinda left, the mailbag washed ashore on Tanambogo, where it was found by RAAF CPL John Brett. It was obvious that Lieutenant McFarlane's stint as port director was a fiasco. His actions, and those of Captain Rothery, eventually led to much correspondence between the High Commissioner and the Australian Prime Minister. McFarlane subsequently would more than make up for it, however, by his later service as a coast watcher on Guadalcanal. The day after Marinda departed Gavutu, 4 civilians who had been denied passage were discovered on board. The Marinda thus docked at Sydney with 124 passengers, including 3 Japanese internees and the 6 soldiers who guarded them. 2 of the Japanese were the men from Gizo, Senanga and Pisita, who had turned themselves over peacefully, leaving behind their native wives and children. The third, Koyama, had worked for Leavers for many years. After the Tulagi area was evacuated, the commando detachment took over the Leavers' #5 bungalows on Gavutu, which provided quarters far better than those of the air unit on Tanambogo, where they had relocated from Tulagi when the Pacific War began. With the old bucket of bolts, as Burns Philp's manager Val Murphy called the Marinda, on her way to Australia, the biggest problem left for the administration was to pay off and repatriate the native plantation workers. More than 1,500 were returned to their home islands in the vessels abandoned by the evacuees. Government officials and civilian residents who remained then had to prevent those boats from falling into enemy hands. Most were sailed into Marau Sound at the southeastern edge of Guadalcanal. After a path was cut through the mangrove swamps, vines were strung on the vessel's masts. Within a month, the boats were not noticeable, and they remained out of sight until well after February 1943. The Japanese never knew they were there. The day after the Marinda sailed, the commandos blew up the W.R. Carpenter and Burns Philp marine stores, though they were later sorry they had acted so soon, for some of the items, including area maps, would have been useful later when they finally made their escape. One of the first things the government did was to take down the Tulagi wireless and move it to Auki on Malaita, some 60 miles east. A dummy structure was left, and it was this and the abandoned Tulagi antenna that the Japanese pilots always attempted to knock down, yet always missed. At Auki, the radio station was about 5 miles from the district office and became the government's link with the outside world via Port Vila and Fiji, as well as Noumea, where the Australian Navy maintained a station. The district office, headed by CNF Bengao, was situated near the ocean front, while Merchant and his staff were headquartered farther inland. The officials finally evacuated the capital on the 13th of February, reported that all the government records and mail sacks left on the Macambo docks when the Marinda sailed would have been destroyed by water, if not for who dragged them to shelter. They were subsequently gathered and sent for safekeeping first to Auki and then to the New Hebrides, 500 miles away. The resident commissioner had authorized the district officer to take the records, provided he could secure a boat. Jocelyn managed to commandeer the Leavers' Ketch Combito. Jocelyn set out for Vila on the 5th of March under less than perfect conditions and sailed most of the way with gaff and stay sails after the engine broke down. The government records were eventually put on board the Manora, headed for Sydney. Jocelyn remained on F8 Island, the capital of the New Hebrides, until July. He would return to the Solomons on the 7th of August as a guide for the US 1st Marine Raider Battalion in the invasion of Tulagi.